next question. As we said, a lot of philosophy has come from people who've been there before us and been through things. And again, we don't want to reinvent the wheel and how to get through a crisis. This is a crisis. We've had tons of crises before. We forget about the Vietnam War, and we forget about World War I and World War II and the Spanish flu and smallpox. And we've been through similar things, and people have worked out solutions before. So, and a lot of that knowledge is now recorded in books. So with the time off that I'm having now, I've been reading a lot of books. And what are some of the books that you have found useful in your education and in using to analyze your life experiences? What are some of the useful books that you've found that you might recommend people to utilize while they're on some social isolation lockdown time?
Yeah, awesome. So I used to read a lot of nonfiction, and then I started reading some fiction with like philosophical stories in there, specifically like The Hero's Journey. And so the greatest one, I think, is really one of the most popular out there, is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, just because it's the hero's journey of overcoming challenges and surrendering to the process, and not knowing, like, in that very moment, you might not realize, but like anything can change right after to change your trajectory. But you've got to experience that and process what's happening right now to grow and evolve as a species. And I talk about the second one, which is the 12 Rules of Life by Jordan Peterson. You and I were talking about this just before. I flick open to like a rule and sort of read a couple of pages every night. And it's one that just always brings out something good in there. And one of the ones to relate to Paulo Coelho's book, The Alchemist, is that he talks about the Garden of Eden, and he has like some religious philosophy that he interjects into this book. And he says, Adam and Eve came down into the Garden of Eden, and there was paradise, and it was perfect. They had everything there, the tree of life, the tree of good and evil, and like water and greenery and blah, 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 blah. But then the chaos happened when the serpent came in, and the serpent is representation of life's challenges. That chaos comes in the moments of order. But if Adam and Eve didn't learn how to adapt to that chaos, didn't learn how to adapt to working with the serpent, then they would not have evolved into the human race that we see now, say, or they would have remained an infantile species, very much useless. And so I really love that analogy, because it just paints a picture of what challenge is for us, what chaos is for us. Chaos is evolution. Chaos is change. Chaos is personal growth, if we choose to see it that way. And I hope everyone listening right now really does, and I'm sure they probably already do. But it's hard to say, there could be some really significant challenges and traumatic events that you just go, I don't get it. And I empathize with people like that are just in that moment, and they don't realize that what's there has any benefit for them, because it's hard to imagine some horrific things happening. But I just say to that is, in hindsight, time will reveal the beauty in everything. But this book, Jordan Peterson, 12 Rules for Life, I'm reading more so around, like, a lot of the books I read is around philosophy, around understanding, seeing, conceptualizing life experiences differently, inspirational stories. And it all really comes back to, a lot of it comes back to the truth in the moment. I mean, with Jordan Peterson's, he's talking about like practical steps of like becoming a better person. And that's essentially the journey that I'm on. So a lot of the books that I read are based on that, of like understanding how to become a better person and how to be a better listener. Like one of his chapters is, to become a really good person, you really want to be the best listener. Yes, know what to say and say things to a certain point, but just listen. Because there are a lot of people out there that just need to be heard. And right now we're in social isolation. We are faced with, this isolation that has been imposed on us. But what we don't realize is that there's a lot of people out there right now that have lived in isolation for many, many years, because they're truly alone. They truly have no one to speak to. And we think that we're all good watching Netflix, and isolation's all good because we've got Wi-Fi, we've got electricity, we've got internet. But there's people in houses all over the world that don't have that. They can't just Netflix and chill. And they don't have a couch, they don't have an aircon. And they're still struggling to get enough rice to feed the family. And then there's also the people that are out there that have no family members in that house. So they're already battling with suicide. They're already battling with depression. And now you've just got to take all their interactions out in the outside world. So when they go down the street or to the shops, completely away from them, how are they feeling right now? And then you've got the people, the kids that go home and they can't go to school now, but they're going to still get beaten up by their father. And they're going to still be in a domestic violent household. They're going to still be threatened by their mother or their father, or, you know, they have their sleazy uncle that, you know, touches them inappropriately and says things inappropriately, because that's the case. That's the world that we live in. So it's just to remind us that wherever we are, no matter what, like all the books that I read, yeah, it's for me to become a better person so I can help people empathize and conceptualize the actual reality of the world. And that is, yeah, it is suffering. There are people out there, but we've got to adapt, and we've got to learn that whatever blessings we've got right now, we've got to take them and use them wisely. It's our responsibility to do that.
Look, that just reminded me of when I was in Bali with you, and I was on my yoga instructor's course, and we were getting lessons in philosophy as well. And they talked about the story of the Buddha when, and I'm going to paraphrase the story, not tell it nearly as well as I should, but the basis of the story was a young woman's son dies. He's an infant, 2 years old. And she is completely and utterly distraught, obviously, and she runs around her village asking people to help save her son. And the villagers said, look, sorry, we can't help. There's only one person that might be able to help, and that's the Buddha. And so she runs to the Buddha's house or hut, and he says, yes, I'll be able to help, because she was so distraught. And he said, all you have to do is get some of these seeds and I'll be able to help get your son back to life. And she thought, well, these seeds are freely available in any household. So she starts to run out of the room to get the seeds. And then he stops her and says, look, there's a proviso. You just have to get the seeds from a household which has not suffered a loss of life in their household. And so she runs around and goes from house to house, finds out that everybody in the house has suffered from loss. And every household had suffered pain and crisis and death of somebody. So she realized finally the lesson from the Buddha, that everybody eventually dies and life is suffering, and it's a matter of finding our way through that by the strategies that you and I are talking about now. And she goes back and she becomes the Buddha's first female disciple and learns from him. And it's a story of just understanding that particularly this problem is going to touch everybody. And everybody's in
sure.
So for me, for some of the books, that's a great story. I really loved it. I just remember it then because you reminded of me when you were talking about that. So some of the great books I've been reading while I've been in some of my social isolation is that I found very useful is Jocko Willink's book, Extreme Ownership. I found fantastic, and we're going to reference that later on in a couple of questions. Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink, who's the ex-Navy SEAL commander who had action in Ramadi in Iraq. I can't see the cover because I've read it so many times. Resilience, Eric Greitens, also ex-Navy SEAL, ex-governor of one of the states in the US. I can't remember which one, but I found that it's a series of letters to a friend of his in the Special Forces who was going through a crisis from post-traumatic stress disorder, and I found that book really useful. I really enjoyed Theodore Roosevelt, the book about Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders, which was, I'm fascinated by Theodore Roosevelt and the crisis they had in the Spanish War and how it changed Theodore Roosevelt from being, you know, a government worker to a incredible leader and incredible man who basically, thank goodness for Theodore Roosevelt, because we wouldn't have some of the national parks, we wouldn't have Yellowstone and some of those amazing national parks without. And finally, Empire of the Summer Room.
You love that one,
Empire of the Summer Moon, about the Comanche. And some of that is relevant today too, which we'll talk about soon, because it talks about social isolation and tribal surviving as a tribe, and also adapting and surviving when it talks about the Texas Rangers. And that's an amazing book that I think everybody should read. All right, let's go on and ask. And one of the other books, of course, which I've read and I really did enjoy, but it's hard reading, is Meditations about the
Marcus Aurelius.
Stoic philosopher and Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So
yeah, it's great. That's a great book.